The first light of winter never truly arrived in Frost Creek. It crept instead, pale and unsure, like a guest who knew they were not welcome. Snow lay in long, unbroken sheets across the ground, smoothing the world into silence. Each morning, before the town's doors creaked open, and before the stove smoke rose from chimneys, a lone woman crossed that silence with careful steps, her boots leaving thin scars that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Her name was Eliza May Caldwell, though Frost Creek rarely spoke it aloud. Names required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required mercy. Wrapped in a faded wool shawl, she moved toward the old well at the edge of town, shoulders slightly bowed, not from age, but from the habit of being unseen. The bucket's rope groaned as she lowered it, the sound sharp against the hush of dawn, as if the well itself remembered her when no one else would. Eliza drew water quietly, the way she did everything. She did not look toward the clustered buildings behind her, nor toward the saloon whose windows still glimmered faintly from the night before. She had learned that eyes invited opinions, and opinions in Frost Creek carried teeth. When the bucket surfaced, rimmed with ice, her hands tightened despite the pain. Her fingers were cracked and red, the skin split by cold and work, yet she welcomed the sting. Pain, at least, was honest. By the time the town began to stir, Eliza was already turning away, balancing the sloshing weight with practiced care. That was when the whispers usually began, not loud enough to confront, but loud enough to wound. Mrs. Harriet Boone, ever vigilant behind her lace curtains, leaned toward whoever stood nearest. Silas Crow, lingering outside the saloon with a crooked grin, let out a laugh that held no humor. Even the children, tugged closer by anxious mothers, stared with the unfiltered curiosity of youth, sensing that Eliza was someone to be warned against. No one spoke to her. That, too, was intentional. She walked back to her cabin beyond the far cottonwoods, where the wind cut harder and the snow drifted higher. The structure barely deserved the name home. 2 small rooms, 1 narrow window, and a door that whined when opened. Inside, the cold lingered like a resentful guest. Eliza set the water down and fed the stove the last of her firewood, breaking the pieces smaller than necessary, stretching warmth the way one stretched hope. She ate little, what bread remained, softened in water, and sat by the window, watching frost bloom across the glass. There had been a time when silence frightened her. Now it felt safer than words. Late that morning, as the sun struggled to rise higher than the mountains, Jonah Blackwood stood near the corral on the opposite side of town, fastening his gloves with slow, deliberate movements. He had arrived in Frost Creek months earlier, with little more than a horse, and a past he did not offer for inspection. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the restraint of a man who had learned what violence cost. Most people noticed his quiet competence, his steady work. Few noticed how carefully he observed the world. Jonah had seen Eliza at the well before. Everyone had. But where others saw inconvenience or rumor, Jonah saw patterns. The way she came early to avoid eyes. The way she never lingered. The way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. That morning, as he tightened the cinch on his saddle, he saw her stumble slightly as she lifted the bucket. She recovered quickly, as if balance were something she practiced often. He did not move toward her. Not yet. Jonah understood distance. He had lived long enough to know that help, offered too loudly, could wound more deeply than neglect. The town, however, had no such patience. By afternoon, Frost Creek was awake and restless. Winter pressed people inward, sharpening tempers along with the cold. Mrs. Boone's voice carried across the general store porch as she spoke of decency and lessons. Silas Crow nodded along, spitting into the snow, his gaze drifting toward the road that led to Eliza's cabin. Their words were vague, but their intent was clear. Some people existed to remind others of what not to become. Eliza felt it before she heard it, the way the air thickened when she entered town again for flour. Conversations paused, then resumed in quieter tones. She kept her eyes on the ground, counting steps, reminding herself that she needed nothing from these people beyond what she could pay for. At the counter, old Thomas Reed slid the sack toward her without comment, his lined face unreadable. His fingers lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, a small act of humanity disguised as transaction. Outside, the sky darkened unexpectedly. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, dragging shadows across the snow. The wind picked up, sharp and insistent. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter and started home, her breath shallow as flakes began to fall, slow at first, then thickening into a curtain of white. Halfway to the well, her foot caught on hidden ice. She pitched forward, the sack slipping from her grasp. Flour burst into the snow like pale smoke, and for a moment she stayed there on her knees, staring at the mess. The sound of laughter reached her, Silas again, unmistakable. Shame rose hot and sudden, threatening to steal her breath. She gathered what she could, hands trembling, aware of eyes on her back. She did not see Jonah step away from the hitching post, nor did she hear his boots crunch across the snow. She only felt a presence when a shadow fell beside her, blocking the wind. Jonah did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply stood there, close enough that the laughter faltered, close enough that the silence shifted. Eliza looked up then, meeting his gaze for the first time. His eyes were steady, uncurious. They did not ask questions she could not answer. She nodded once, an acknowledgement, not an invitation, and pushed herself to her feet. Jonah stepped back, giving her space, and she passed him without a word. Yet as she walked away, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not hope. She did not trust hope, but the faint easing of a weight she had carried alone for too long. That night, the storm came in earnest. Snow battered the cabin walls, and the wind howled through the trees like an old grief refusing to sleep. Eliza sat by the dwindling fire, listening, aware that morning would not come easily. Somewhere beyond the white darkness, Frost Creek huddled together, warm and judgmental and small. And somewhere closer than she realized, a man stood looking toward her cabin, measuring the storm not by its strength, but by how long it could be endured. The storm did not end by morning. It merely loosened its grip, as if deciding Frost Creek had learned whatever lesson winter meant to teach. Snow still fell in small, deliberate spirals, quiet as breath. Jonah Blackwood stood outside Eliza Caldwell's cabin before dawn, his coat stiff with ice, listening for any sound from within. The night had been long enough to change him. He had not slept. Some fears, once named, refused to rest. When he finally knocked, it was gentle, knuckles against wood, an invitation rather than a demand. There was no answer at first. Then the door opened just enough for a sliver of firelight to spill onto the snow. Eliza's face appeared in that narrow space, pale and tired, but alert. She did not ask why he had come. She only stepped back, allowing him in. Inside, the room smelled of damp wool and fading embers. Jonah removed his hat and stood uncertainly, as though unsure where his presence belonged. Eliza poured water into a tin cup and handed it to him, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. It was nothing, and yet it was everything, proof that she did not fear him. They spoke little. Words felt unnecessary, even dangerous, as if they might disturb something fragile between them. Jonah added wood to the stove without asking. Eliza watched him do it, noting how he measured each log, how he waited for the flame to catch before stepping away. He worked as though he intended to leave things better than he found them. By midday, the storm had eased enough for the town to re-emerge. Smoke rose again from chimneys, and Frost Creek resumed its watchful habits. News traveled quickly there, even when no one admitted to carrying it. By the time Jonah walked back with Eliza toward the well, the windows were alive with movement. Mrs. Harriet Boone stood outside the general store, her mouth tightening as she took in the sight of them together. Silas Crow leaned against the saloon rail, a sneer curling his lips. The space between Eliza and Jonah was small but deliberate, not touching, not distant. They walked as equals, and that unsettled the town more than open defiance ever could. At the well, Eliza reached for the bucket as she always had, but this time her hands were steadier. Jonah remained a step behind, not offering help, simply present. When Silas laughed and muttered something crude, the sound echoed too loudly in the cold air. Jonah turned his head slowly, meeting Silas's gaze with calm that held no threat, only certainty. The laughter died where it stood. No one spoke after that. The rope creaked, the bucket rose, and Eliza filled her pail without incident. It was a small victory, barely worth naming, yet it changed the shape of the morning. When she turned to leave, old Thomas Reed nodded to her, the smallest of gestures, but one she felt in her bones. The days that followed unfolded differently. Jonah did not announce himself as her protector, nor did Eliza seek him out. Their connection grew in the quiet spaces between tasks. A shared glance across the yard, the discovery of firewood stacked neatly by her door, the way Jonah always seemed to be working nearby when the cold pressed hardest. Eliza responded in kind, leaving a loaf of bread on his porch, mending a torn glove she found abandoned. Frost Creek watched, confused and resistant. The town thrived on certainty, and this unsettled it. Mrs. Boone spoke less. Silas drank more. Judgment, when deprived of its target, turned inward. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Eliza stood at her window and realized she was no longer counting what she lacked. The cold was still there. The past remained heavy. Yet something within her had shifted, aligning itself with the simple truth that she was not invisible. Being seen, she learned, did not require permission. The final storm of the season arrived without warning. Snow fell thick and fast, swallowing the road, erasing the boundaries between cabin and town. Eliza set out anyway, knowing her supplies were low. Halfway to the well, the world tilted. She felt herself sinking, strength draining as the cold reached deeper than bone. Jonah found her where the path disappeared, her form half buried in white. He lifted her with care, carrying her back through the storm, his breath steady, his step sure. Inside the cabin, he wrapped her in blankets and fed the fire until warmth returned to her limbs. She woke to the sound of his breathing, slow and even, and for the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone. Morning came clear and bright. The storm had broken, leaving the land scrubbed clean. Eliza stepped outside, Jonah at her side, and the cold felt different, sharp, but no longer cruel. Frost Creek watched from its doorways, uncertain what to make of the woman who stood taller now. Her gaze lifted. She did not ask the town for forgiveness, nor did she wait for acceptance. She had endured winter and learned its truth. Survival was not merely the act of staying alive, but the courage to remain oneself when the world insisted otherwise. As they walked back toward the well, sunlight glinting off the snow, the future remained unwritten. That, Eliza realized, was its greatest gift. Some stories did not end when the cold receded. They began there, in the quiet after endurance, where dignity took root and waited to grow.